Hey, you guys, and welcome to another sword sharpening segment brought to you by the School of Faith and Thought's Word of God movement, whereby we read through the Bible one chapter at a time with a little bit of commentary by myself, just to help us dig a bit deeper into the Word and understand it a little bit more. Today, we're going to be reading from Genesis chapter 13. Let's just get straight into it. We're back with Abram and his nephew Lot. If you're not sure who these people are, please check out the video previous to this one, Genesis chapter 12, whereby we go through a little bit of a family tree and expand a bit more on who these people were. I'll throw some pictures up on the screen so you can see what I think they may have looked like. Abraham is the older fella and Lot, his nephew, is the younger one. But we're going to get straight into it, you guys. Let's begin Genesis chapter 13, starting from verse 1. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. How many times aren't we guilty of this, right? Come on. How many times have we not deviated from the plan that God has for our life, from the word that God has given us, from the promises that God has made to us, and said, oh, I need to step out. I need to do something. I need to take control of this situation. I need to go somewhere or see someone or say something in order to protect myself or preserve myself or provide for my family, despite God giving us a clear indication that he's in control and he's got our back. This is exactly what we were just talking about in Genesis chapter 12, that God had made a promise to Abraham that he was going to have his back, and Abraham had deviated from that. Well, now Abraham has returned back to the altar of God and called back upon the name of the Lord. He's realized that he can't do this on his own. He can't provide for his family, and he truly needs God. He's returned to his place of worship and seeking the Lord. Verse 5. Lot also, who went with Abram, Lot the nephew, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So it's interesting that they would put that last sentence in there, the Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. I think it's put there to emphasize to us that Lot and Abram were already surrounded by enemies, because certainly the Canaanites and Perizzites at this point were not their friends, especially considering that God had already told Abram that he was going to actually give him the whole land of Canaan. So at some point, he was going to become the adversary of Canaan and be taking that land back from them into God's hands, into God's territory. And so it was kind of like this. Look, we're already surrounded by enemies. We don't need to fight between each other. Let's not make ourselves enemies of each other as well. We're seeing that the herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot were in strife and already fighting with each other, probably because they had so many cattle and so many sheep that now it was becoming a point of contention who was going to get this best green grass, who was going to get access to this water hole. So there were these kinds of issues already going on inside their camp. And these arguments had become so frequent that word of them had gotten back to Abram and to Lot. So in verse 8, Abram says to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, then I'll take to the left." This is Abram being super generous to his nephew Lot. He's saying, look, we obviously can't share this land together. There's not enough resources for all of us. We don't need to make each other enemies of each other as well. We're already surrounded by other enemies. So how about you choose some land and you go there with your folk, and I'll take the land that you don't want, and I'll stay here with my folk. We can still all get along. We can still all be allies, but we can divide this and allocate this evenly between the both of us. Verse 10 says, "And Lot lifted his eyes, and he saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. And we get these pictures of abundance and greenery and all these sorts of things when we think of the land of Egypt and the garden of the Lord. But you know what else comes to mind when we think of the garden of the Lord and the land of Egypt? Adultery, temptation. We need to remember that the garden of the Lord was the source of the initial temptation on mankind. The land of Egypt was full of idolatry and wasn't a God-fearing or God-worshipping nation at all. And so even though to the eyes, what he's seeing is that it was well watered, he obviously wasn't picking up spiritually the state of this land. And clearly we know that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because it even says that in verse 10, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. These places looked good. They looked prosperous. They looked tempting. They looked inviting. And yet we all know what the end of this is. Verse 11 says, Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. So let's quickly have a look at this map, which is going to show us whereabouts this plain of the Jordan is, just so that we're clear on what we're looking at. I showed you guys this map when we were reading Genesis chapter 12, that we're now here somewhere around the Bethel area, between Bethel and Ai, or Ai, where Abram made his initial altar to the Lord. They've returned there. So do you guys see this little tiny blue bit here to the right of Jerusalem, which is here, and this black line that runs into it? Now, this black line that runs into it, you guys, is actually the Jordan River, the River Jordan, and it runs into what we call the Dead Sea. Let's zoom in. You can see here now, there is the Dead Sea. So we know that going upwards of this, I'm going to put a nice arrow, going upwards of this, you guys, is the Jordan River. The Jordan River runs into it, and this is why it was called the Plains of the Jordan. We're seeing now that Sodom and Gomorrah were actually somewhere along here, across the plains of the Jordan. I know that on this map it says here and here, but I mean, come on guys, that's in the middle of the Dead Sea. They weren't literally here. They were more in this little area of land just here. So I can imagine that somewhere, in this wilderness area, in this mountainous area over here, is probably where Lot and Abram were, where they were standing and looking out at this beautiful land, and Abram saying, well, do you want to go this direction or do you want to go this direction? And Lot looks out and he sees this wonderful green abundant place here, and he says, oh yes, I want this. And so he goes down and he pitches his tent somewhere in this area. Again, it's really hard for us to know exactly where all these places were, but I hope these maps just help you get a little bit of a feel of the story so that it can feel a little bit more immersive. Because the Word of God doesn't need to be boring, you guys. It really doesn't. It is a fantastic and an interesting book, and certainly our guidebook for life. Picking up again from verse 12, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. This is an incredible promise, considering that Abram is already well past 75 years old. We know that he was 75 years old when he started traveling down through Canaan, ends up in Egypt, segueing back to Canaan now. So he doesn't actually have any children of his own. Sarai, his wife, is barren. We know that she cannot have children. And because she can't have children, you're looking at this going, well, who are the descendants going to be? Are the descendants going to be Lot, his nephew, his brother's son? Where is this going to be coming from? And I'm sure that to Abram, he had these questions. But despite these questions, it says in verse 18 that then Abram moved his tent and he went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and he built an altar there to the Lord. So once God spoke to him and said, "Arise and walk, arise and go and do something," that was when he then moved his tent. You see, I think that Abram learnt something from his experience in Egypt in Genesis 12. Here in Genesis 13, we see a man that, despite how something looks, despite what land he probably thought was best, he was prepared to tell his nephew, "Look, you take whatever land you see fit," because he trusted that God was going to be able to keep him no matter where he was, no matter in what situation he was in or what land he ended up being in. And that's a wonderful progression. So going back to this map again, where I've just previously showed you guys, again, where Sodom and Gomorrah is and kind of roughly where Lot was moved to, we now know that Abraham has also picked up his tent and he's moved all the way up here, see, to Hebron. There's Hebron. So they've separated quite a way between each other. If you take it that this is Hebron and Lot is kind of in this sort of an area here, they've obviously separated quite a way apart. Now we know that troubling times lay ahead for Lot and his family because they've just moved into Sodom and Gomorrah, where there is exceeding wickedness and sinfulness, as per verse 13. And we also know that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is coming, as mentioned in verse 10. So how exactly is that going to look? Well, I guess you guys are going to have to stick around and continue this journey through Genesis to find the answers to those questions. Look, if you've enjoyed today's video, please can you hit the like button down below and also subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. If you enjoy this kind of content and you would like to continue reading through the Bible with me, one chapter at a time with a little bit of commentary. I hope you guys have enjoyed today's video. Thank you so very much for tuning in. Take care, and until next time, God bless.